Hey everyone, I'm Jordan Jones, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. The Magi are undeniably one of the most visually recognizable aspects of any nativity scene. Like me, you can probably close your eyes and instantly see a clear image of these gift-bearing visitors. However, our assumed familiarity with these individuals from Matthew's nativity account can lead us to miss or supply important details about them, creating a version of characters and events that aren't really there. So this week, we're going to talk about the Magi, who they were, what they're doing in Matthew at all, and how their reputation and representation has grown over time. To walk us through all this, I'm happy to have been joined by Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, Associate Professor of Religion at Ferrum College and author of The Magi, who they were, how they've been remembered, and why they still fascinate. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about those mysterious visitors, the Magi. Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you're a very busy guy and currently very busy in Rome, leading a trip with some students, so we really appreciate you taking the time today to come talk with us about a mysterious group, the Magi from Matthew. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan, for having me on.
I love your book, right? This is the book. We're going to put the link down in the description for anyone that is looking for more from you. Your book, The Magi, which kind of tips the hand a little bit with where some of we're going to go here. I think it's a wonderfully accessible book for people. And before we jump into some of how we're going to unpack the mystery of who they are, could you tell a little bit about what brought you to writing something about just them? Because I think for some people, they'll say, you wrote a whole book on the Magi. Isn't that kind of a brief section of Matthew? Like, there's not a lot there, right? So how did you bring together materials to write a book? What's going on in that?
Yeah, it really, I mean, that's one of the things I kind of talk about in the intro is just how short this passage is, right? It's like 12 verses in Matthew and very, I mean, very vague, right? I mean, not in a bad way. It's just, it's not nearly as detailed as people remember it from their kind of childhood. If you grew up, with nativity plays and those sorts of things. And so really what led me to write it was, I had just defended my dissertation and I was kind of, looking for the next thing to do. And I just I took a little bit of pleasure just going to the library and just spending a day kind of poking around. And one of my dissertation committee members had mentioned that he was surprised that I didn't talk about the Magi in my dissertation, which was on the Proto-Gospel of James, which doesn't include the story of the Magi. And so I just sort of started to think about, what would it look like to do something on the Magi and, an article or something like that. But the more I read that day and then in the coming weeks, I just started seeing, a lot of, looking at biblical commentaries, I started seeing a lot of the same sorts of explanations for them. They're Gentiles from the East and they're astrologers and they're all of these things. And I just kind of found myself very dissatisfied by that. And I just kept thinking there has to be more here. And so then I started poking around in kind of more reception oriented stuff and seeing, what sort of people today were saying about them. And as it turns out, people today say all sorts of things about them. There's people who are talking about, sorcery and necromancy and, the star is a UFO and all of those things. And so I thought, well, I wonder now what's happened in between the two. And then I started just seeing that there's this whole very rich tradition involving these characters that I mean, Matthew's story is just really a seed that grows into this entire forest. And so it took me a little while to really get around to writing it, but I had just, pages and pages of notes sitting on my desk forever. And then, during the COVID pandemic, and I was kind of looking for something to do with the time that I wasn't spending commuting to college. And then I talked with a friend of mine at Fortress and said, is this something that we want to do? And he said, yeah, it sounds interesting. And then here we are.
I agree. It's a fascinating read for anyone that is looking for more. It's a great resource because I think one of my favorite things about it is the way you address this issue of something that is familiar, we think. We think we feel so familiar with it that can lead us to gloss over misimportant information or provide materials in as we're reading things that can come from sometimes just movies or some of these later traditions that we aren't quite as aware of. For the audience, what are some of those things for you as you worked through this that either you had to strip away for yourself that were some of these familiar pieces that you had to wrestle with, or you think that the listener might say, I think I know these details that maybe they should immediately check so that they can start to ask questions about the Magi?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea of just sort of the familiarity, I think in the book I describe it as sort of familiarity breeds unfamiliarity, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, a quintessential example that I use in my classes to talk about this, that's not the Magi, because my students sometimes roll their eyes, are like, oh no, not the Magi again. But, the story of Moses and Exodus is a great example of, when I ask my students to retell me that story, even after they've already read it, and they'll say things like, well, Moses' mother takes him down to the river and she puts him in a basket and floats him down the river. That never happens in Exodus. She takes him down. The story is actually a lot more interesting when you read it, and when you read it intentionally as somebody reading it for the first time. You see that it's a story of strategy, and she's placing Moses on the bank of the river, and it just becomes a lot more interesting. So, with the Magi, I think, one of the great places to start is, in most of our iconography and narratives about these characters, there's three of them, right? Matthew never says there's three Magi.
Right, there's three. There's three kings, there's three Magi,
yeah.
there's three.
Right. But there's, and in Matthew, there's really not a specified number. There are three gifts, but, 12 people can give the same three gifts. 20 people can give the same three gifts. And so, does Matthew imagine that there's three? I mean, probably, but he never says that, right? He never specifies that. He never says that they're kings. In fact, the way that he describes them as Magi, king is one of the incorrect ways to translate that. I mean, that's just not the case. I mean, there's some kings who are described as Magi, but the word Magi does not mean king. So the number, the identity, really why they're coming to see Jesus in the first place, Matthew doesn't really tell us. And where they're from. And one thing I also found when I kind of went back and started reading it anew at the start of this was, I sort of remembered in my mind's eye these characters having a lot more dialogue in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Like talking to people and really kind of getting into conversations. And they really don't. I mean, they only say one thing, like we're where is the one born king of the Judeans? That's all they say in the entire story. And presumably, if you want to do the whole getting behind the narrative kind of thing, I mean, presumably they're having conversations with these other people, but Matthew doesn't have any of their dialogue. So really, I mean, at a very kind of basic level, I think just sort of taking almost all the details that we imagine, and those come from various different places. They come from nativities. They come from Christmas movies, Christmas stories, and just basically taking all of those and realizing that almost all of them are absent from Matthew's story.
As we're pulling those things away, I think for some people there can be the immediate reaction that you're trying to strip detail and richness away from this story. How would you frame this differently? Because you do talk a little bit in your book about the approach between seeing them as literary creations or historical, and there can be different approaches in here. And I think for some people, the gut reaction to trying to pull some of this out is you're attacking this scene, you're attacking the story of the Magi or the nativity story. But that's not how you're coming at this in the book. And I think, as you say, it makes them more interesting to not. So how do you respond to students or others when they say that it feels like you're on the attack when you're doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of am, but not in a malevolent way, And so I do sort of want to say, let's take all of the details away and let's get back as close as we can to just understanding the story as Matthew presents it. But as I do in the book, I do treat these characters first and foremost as literary literary characters. So did they exist? Personally, I don't think they did. But also, you can still do fun things with the story even if they did. So my goal is not to, as you know, if you've read the book, my goal is not to sort of enter into this and say, you're a fool if you think that the Magi existed. It actually doesn't matter to me. But to kind of strip away these details and to be able to say, okay, let's get back to examining that question of what is Matthew trying to do with these characters? And in order to ask
Right.
that question and to answer it honestly, you do have to get back to Matthew's story. What does he include? What doesn't he include? And in the end, I think what I really try to do through the whole book is to say all of these other details that kind of accrete over time. These are real construals of meaning. I mean, the readers, when readers fill in these gaps, that is meaningful, and that is, I mean, I am one of those scholars who thinks that searching for what the author meant is an important step in interpretation. I think that we do have to at least try that without without presuming that we can ever really reach it. But we do have to kind of start there. But then looking at all of those ways that the story has developed, and seeing the types of details that readers do fill in with their imaginations, their creativity, that can also help you better to understand what Matthew was doing in that story. And so, in some ways, I am attacking the sort of approach of, I know what the story says. Well, you don't really. Like, go back and read it again, start over, and then let's put the pieces back together.
I think that approach of trying to balance, as you discuss this, the respect for what did it say and the value of how these things have become attached to it is a really helpful framework for people as they're trying to come to a story that for many people is one of the most preciously held mental images, biblical texts, that this is a difficult one for many to ask questions about or to wrestle with. Because if you're saying that they're literary creations in the characters of the Magi, how far does that go into the realm of the other parts of what Matthew is doing and how we're pulling those things apart? But as you say, to try to get to what is Matthew saying? And
Right.
why is Matthew saying it? It just opens up more questions for them. So can we return to one of these names that you've thrown out in trying to get back to what Matthew says?
Mm-hmm.
The name of the book, the name of the people, because we've been using the term Magi,
Mm-hmm.
and people might be thinking, I know them as wise men. I know them as kings, although you've already talked a little bit about that. I
Right.
thought that they were these titles. What is this word that you're using? Why are you choosing to use this
Mm-hmm.
instead of some of these other more commonly known terms?
Sure. So that was one of those questions. I spent a lot of time just thinking about the best way to translate this Greek word. So the Greek word that Matthew uses is magos, and for him the plural magoi, and so I chose to ultimately just leave it as kind of a loan word and say magi. And this is not I'm not certainly not the first person to do that, but yeah, modern translations render this term in a number of different ways. I'm not going to be able to remember all of them matching up, how they all match up in my brain, but wise men, astrologers. I don't know of any that actually do say kings aside from the hymn, but regardless, this is one of the ways that they've been
Mm-hmm.
understood as well. And so I sort of approach it as in the book to talk about the ways that it could be translated kind of more literally, and the most literal way of translating this is just to use the English word that comes from this word, which is magician, and to say, magicians from the east came to Jerusalem, and that would have been, I think, something that I could have done, and it would have been fine because all translation is interpretation. But at the end of the day, magician just has too much baggage with it, and I didn't feel
Yeah.
comfortable because I don't think Matthew imagines them like a magician. In sort of modern parlance, a magician is somebody who does tricks, right? And to
Right.
or if depending on your perspective, right, a magician could be an evil kind of sorcerer figure. And so what I did was I went back and kind of looked at the various different things that Magi are kind of known for in ancient Greek literature. And they're known for certainly their wisdom, right? They have the ability to interpret dreams, and they have the ability to give advice in other texts like Herodotus and all sorts of other Greek and Roman authors. But they're also religious specialists. So they are, you could very well also translate magi as priests, but not, and that also has some baggage, because what kind of priests are they, right?
Uh-huh.
And so at the end of the day, and astrologers is also, of course, one of those things very common in the commentaries, like, oh, they're astrologers from the East, and people say things like magi were figures who were interested in the stars and astrology or whatever. That's actually not the case. If you look at the ancient literature, the stars are, I think they sort of appear once or twice, but that's not, when you lay it all out, that's not what they're known for. They're much more associated with sacrifice, with interpreting dreams, and also just finding symbolism and finding significance in mundane things like stars. And
Interesting.
so I ultimately just decided, let's just keep it as magi. And if we keep it as magi, then we sort of, every time we encounter that word, we then re-encounter the strangeness of it. And to say, like, we really don't know why Matthew chose to call them this, because it is also a very loaded term in the ancient world.
Right. Well, and you've addressed in some of the modern approaches that we have baggage if we were to translate it as priest or magician.
Mm-hmm.
Within Matthew's context, as you note, it's a loaded term for him too, and for his audience.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see things in here, like in the decision to attach them to a star, if that's outside of some of the most common associations, in ways he's trying to grapple with the baggage people might be bringing to the term? Or just choosing to kind of bypass some of that and use the name outside of addressing why?
Yeah, I think, that's a really, really great question. Sort of, is he aware that the term has baggage? Most certainly, yes. I can't imagine that Matthew is saying, like, oh, I had no idea, that people sometimes think poorly of Magi, right? And so there's
I
this
just
kind of
really liked the name and decided it fit, and I'm going
right.
to throw that in.
It was just a great word, and so it's one of those words. It's one of those words that in the ancient world, just like in the modern world, like the word magician, if you say somebody's a magician, like, oh, that could be positive or negative depending on where you're at, in your thought. But I think Matthew is certainly smart enough and probably well read enough that he's aware that there's kind of two camps when it comes to magi. There are magi who are the highly trained, respected priest, diviner, whatever you want to call them, from the East, from this kind of exotic land. But then I think Matthew also has to be aware of the other connotation, which is that magi are frauds and that they're dangerous in the sense of being deceptive. So and you see this tension already in the New Testament. So in the Gospel of Luke, you have two magoi, or two, I guess two magoi, and they're both negative figures. One is Simon, who becomes Simon Magus in later tradition, and he is there trying to. He really likes watching the apostles do these kind of miracles, and he basically goes to Peter and is like, how much will it cost for me to be able to do this? And he's
Right.
referring to money. And this is not good for Luke. Like Luke sees him as a negative character, and he's very, very clear that he's a negative character because he gets cursed and he's like, thrown out of the narrative. And then the other one is a character named Bar Jesus, also called Elymas, who is who's also sort of trying to thwart the efforts of Paul to convert this government figure, and he also is punished and sort of has to slink away. But in both of these stories, I feel like the reason that Matthew is probably aware of the connotations, but is also not trying to he's not trying to leave his readers on the fence. I don't think he's aware of these connotations, but he's also sort of presenting these characters in a mostly positive light, I think, or at the very least, a kind of neutral light. They're not negative by any sense. I think it was Raymond Brown who made his comment in his Infancy Gospels book, or the Birth of the Messiah book, where he said, in the Gospel of Matthew, they are wholly positive characters, and I think I pretty much agree with that. But the fact that Matthew doesn't have them in any sort of conflict or anything like that suggests that he is seeing them not as kind of nefarious in any way. And I think he's encouraging his readers to also just see them as, if he is aware of the connotation, these are the good magi, not the bad ones.
Using that as the distinction without having to get into the weeds of explaining
Right.
who they are. A question
Correct.
I guess I have in the fact that they show up here in Matthew, but then also in Luke, which are the two places we have birth narratives as well. Do you see any type of relationship in the way that Luke uses them differently? Is there an awareness, do you think, of Matthew and Matthew's magi there in trying to move that, or just something different? They just are happening to show up here, and that isn't a real connection between them.
Yeah, so that's getting into that synoptic problem, right? And
Yeah.
does Luke know Luke know Matthew's gospel? So we're going to upset a lot of people by going down this road, but we're going to do it. So there's those two different views, two different primary views on the synoptic problem. One is that Matthew and Luke don't know each other, and that they're writing independently using similar sources. And then the other view is that Matthew and Luke both know Mark, and that Luke is also drawing from Matthew. So your question, I think, is best addressed if we take that second view, right? So let's pretend, that maybe Luke knows Matthew. If Luke knows Matthew, which is possible, I'm not going to take a stance on whether that's actually true, because I don't want to upset people too bad. But if Luke really knows Matthew, then I think it's entirely possible that Luke takes Matthew's story, and his birth story rather, and then he sort of tweaks it a little bit. So in Luke's birth story, Jesus still gets visitors, but they're not magi; they are shepherds, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not religious professionals; they are people on the outskirts, or they are people out in the fields. They are sort of these, just completely different from what we see as the baggage that the Magi carry. And then if we still assume, right, that Luke is drawing from Matthew, it's also possible that Luke is, when he gets to Acts, is throwing in these references to these bad Magi, maybe I could see sort of a maybe throwing a little bit of shade on, like, no, the Magi that you see over here are not great. Magi are actually this type of person. And I think that's possible because, in Luke's prologue, he's the only canonical evangelist who does this, but he tells his readers that he's using, well, first of all, he tells his readers that he's using sources, but he also acknowledges the existence of other gospels. He says, many have done this before, and now I'm doing it my own way, right? I'm doing it differently to give you an orderly account. And so I think it's an interesting thought exercise to say, maybe Luke is so offended by Matthew's Magi that he decides to not only write them out of Matthew's birth story, but then to also throw a couple stones over the wall when he gets to Acts and say, this is why I got these guys out of there, because they're hucksters.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, we're not going to go down that whole path. It's just, I know it's one of those things that sometimes gets brought up of, if there is a connection, could there be? Again, because there is so little said in Matthew, and Matthew isn't explicit in all of why they show up or what they're doing here, that leads to this kind of speculation. Another thing that you discuss in your book that I think might be new information for some people is the connection between the Magi and kings specifically in their role. Could you say a little bit about how that shows up in Greek literature and how that might be present in some of what Matthew is or is not doing with them?
Absolutely. So the primary source that I look at to talk about Magi and other Greek literature is Herodotus, and I use a lot of other texts to kind of supplement that, where we see similar themes. But one of the things, a professor of mine always says that if you're not surprised when you're doing research, then you're not really doing research. And one of the things I was very surprised about when I started kind of going down that road and seeing how these other authors are using that term is just how frequently Magi in Greek literature are appearing in proximity to kings. And so they are, I mean, they are almost always, I won't say always, but they are almost always presented as interested in sort of being in that circle of power. In some places in Herodotus, they're actually usurping the kingship and taking it for themselves, and that's one of those really interesting dynamics. But otherwise, you find them performing sacrifices to ensure victories in battle. You see them serving as advisors. A king has a dream or a king needs advice, and they come in and they give advice and they interpret dreams. Um, and my takeaway from all of that is that sort of in ancient literature, when the Magi show up and the king is involved, there's either going to be some sort of validation of that kingship, or there's going to be a shakeup of some sort. And in Matthew, if you read it through that lens, in Matthew we kind of have both, right?
Yeah, you
So
do get both.
yeah, and so like when the Magi show up, they go to Jerusalem first because they're looking for the one born king of the Judeans. And where would you find the king of the Judeans? You would find them in Jerusalem. And so they go there and then they say, "We're looking for the one born king of the Judeans." And then Herod, well, everyone in Jerusalem is panicked. Herod sort of says without saying that he's not the one born king of the Judeans. And then they send them to Bethlehem. And so there you have sort of a bit of shade thrown on Herod's kingship, which is one that's fraught and complicated. And then you have them going to Bethlehem, in the place you wouldn't expect to find the legitimate king, but that's where they find him. And by presenting their gifts, they are paying tribute to the one born king of the Judeans. They are acknowledging him. And as Magi, they are saying, this is the real king. And that's a really, really interesting and subtle for us political move on the part of the author.
And it's one of those things that when we're trying to read what's in Matthew's account and remove some of those other things, that's one of those wonderful details that starts to pop out if you're placing this in the context that Matthew might be trying to place this in, and removing some of ours that makes it not just, there's not a ton of dialogue potentially, but the political maneuvering of how they're showing up in the double play with Herod is so fascinating. That why does Herod come in? Because I think for a lot of people, the connection with Herod is just, is this an insult to Herod? Look, right. These individuals can come in and they can recognize that this one being born is someone, and Herod, the one who is here, can't, right. Which might be something that Matthew is doing here, but it's also right. doing more.
Right. And really, if you start thinking about it through this, through that lens, it kind of shines a bit of light on the story just doesn't make a whole lot of sense otherwise. If this star is sort of a star that is designed to lead them to Jesus, then then why did they go to Jerusalem, right? The star doesn't really lead them to Jerusalem, though. The star they interpret as they need to go to Jerusalem, right? And so the story only makes sense, though, if they are searching for a king. And they don't find the king where they're looking for him, but they find him in this unexpected place. And so that kind of meaning, though, as I argue, that kind of meaning it would have been much clearer to Matthew's readers than it would have been to us, than it is to us, because of that sort of connotation with what sorts of people are the Magi around, and who are they locating themselves with.
You mentioned the gifts, which is one of the most famous things associated with them, the right. gold, the frankincense, the myrrh that they bring. And for people that maybe you're most familiar with this by watching Life of Brian, that's one of those through lines that comes through wonderfully there too. But this is one of those aspects of them, because Matthew isn't explicit in, well, this is why they brought these gifts. And sometimes right. Matthew is, right, like beat us over the head with the detail of I told you this and now I'm telling you this. And here, again, we don't get a lot.
Right.
Is there something you see within the context that might be presented in this? Is this just the value of them? There's been a lot of later interpretations that come to this. Could you walk the listeners through some of how those gifts have maybe originally been presented and unfolded over time into more interpretations?
Sure. Yeah. So the more I think there is a very rich history, right, of these gifts. Like, where are they coming from? what do they symbolize? And later stories do kind of unpack that. They sort of create these backstories for those gifts. One of the more, I think, more prevalent interpretations that you get is that these gifts are indicative of some sort of important piece of Jesus's identity. And so, or maybe a hope of what he will grow into or something like that. And so in this model, gold is a gift signifying his sort of royal lineage. Frankincense as an incense would be something that would either symbolize, priesthood or divinity, or something about, something related to like temple worship. And then myrrh, as the interpretation goes, myrrh is a sort of burial spice or something like this. And so he's a king, he's God and or a priest, and he's going to die. So I think those are actually very interesting interpretations, and I don't aim to kind of destroy any of them, but I don't think that's what Matthew's after, because I just don't see where that plays out in Matthew. I just don't see it. The myrrh, especially, as if you look at how myrrh is used in the ancient world, it's not a burial ointment; it's a spice. It's something that people ingest, as well as flavor burial ointments with. I mean, it's one of those multi-use kind of things. And so, I think at the end of the day, those things, those interpretations develop and they kind of get added on. But I think in my read, Matthew has chosen these things because there are other stories of people paying tribute to kings and queens with these types of gifts, with gold and with incense. And so I think Matthew is trying to imagine three very commonly known expensive items. So like, gold is obviously expensive, but frankincense and myrrh are also, they're not necessarily super hard to come by, but they are kind of, produced in smaller quantities, and they are expensive. So I think in my read, I think Matthew's after that. They are giving him kingly gifts because they're validating his kingship.
Something that I, in growing up, had also heard in the connection and the mystery of their identity is the potential tie between them coming from the East, broad stroke somewhere, and the spice trade, and this is supposed to be indicative of them coming from one of these distant regions and the spice moving around through the world. Does that feel like something within Matthew's world outside of that? Because for me, it was one of those like, I guess that could be in there. It doesn't feel like it makes a ton of sense. That feels kind of like a stretch, but I guess if you're looking for an explanation, it could be one.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think it's one of those things that, there's sort of these interesting, you can make those arguments, I think, but as far as Matthew's concerned, I just, whether Matthew thought these people were historical figures or not, I just don't really think there's any way of knowing. And I think that the spice trade kind of angle is often used to kind of bolster the historicity of the story, to say, they came in on the Silk Road or something like this. And if you want to sort of go down that road, it really doesn't change the nature of that sort of political message that Matthew's trying to build here with this story. But it also, in terms of understanding the story, it doesn't do much really. It's like, I don't know why there's time spent on that, because it just doesn't add anything to the interpretation of the story. It just doesn't. So, regardless of where the gifts come from, whether they're coming from Arabia or whether they're coming from India, they're still valuable gifts, and they're still brought by people who validate kingships.
Yeah, it feels like, as you're hearing this, right, for me hearing this growing up, it's like it's one of those moments where it feels like we're focusing on the wrong question, potentially.
Right.
Like in picking this detail to try to wrestle with in a story where there's lots of other details that are vague, that we're focusing on an odd moment here within this. And that is something that you talk about in your book, that the wrestling with the gaps is something that has happened for a long period of time. And you mentioned one of these texts early on, the Proto-Gospel of James. For people that are thinking, Okay, well, if you're saying that there is maybe less detail here than I thought,
Mhm.
where do the traditions that I think I know associated with these individuals come from? Is this all something that's coming from Hollywood and movies later on, or is this something that has its roots in older faith traditions that has made its way across over time? Where should
Mhm.
people start to frame how that tradition expands?
Yeah, so the proto gospel of James is a really famous apocryphal, not an early non-canonical infancy gospel that talks about the birth and childhood of Mary, and then the birth of Jesus, and it includes the Magi. And the proto gospel of James is uh, a lot of apocryphal non-canonical texts. I like to imagine as a type of fan fiction, like ancient fan fiction, right? When you read this story in Matthew, there's Matthew doesn't say where they're from. Matthew doesn't say how many there are. He doesn't give them names. He doesn't say
Mm-hmm.
why they bring the gifts. um, and also he doesn't really say, he doesn't really have any, he doesn't really give any indication like why, what's unique about this star, right? And why do they seem
Right.
like the only ones who can
That this
see
is
it,
the
right?
star, they picked this one, and then they go to the wrong place. So it's an
Right.
important star, but maybe not the most specific of stars.
Right, exactly. And so like their initial interpretation is, I mean, it's partly right. Like, they go to the place where the king of the Judeans should be. But anyway, so I mean, the way that fan fiction works, of course, is that uh, people only write fan fiction if they like the story, right, that they're fan fictioning. I think there's probably plenty of
The popular
anomalies.
ones.
Yeah, exactly. So when you have somebody like the proto gospel of James, that author, he's taking the story in Matthew, and he's when he gets to the Magi story, and one of the things that he fills out is the nature of this star, and he says, the Magi come and they say, we saw his star and it's rising. It was brighter than all the other stars, and when it shined, all of the other stars were dimmed, right? And okay, so what he's doing there is he's kind of expanding. I almost like to think about it as, in addition to kind of fan fiction, when you're telling a story to a kid and the kid says, well, what about this? And why does he do that? And then you kind of have to fill in that backstory a little bit. And then when you do that enough, that backstory then becomes part of the story. And so
Mm-hmm.
the proto gospel, though, is sort of then highlighting, the mysterious nature of this star. And so I think these texts really, they do have some revisionist tendencies. So there's some non-canonical texts that will change details that are in the text that they're kind of reworking and rewriting. But overall, I see apocryphal gospels and other texts as really just trying to kind of clarify these stories. So the Magi do get names eventually because people are apparently very unsettled by nameless characters, and so they receive names, they receive a point of origin, all of those they get their backstory, and so I think that these texts are really trying to grapple with those gaps and to say, we want these questions answered, so we're gonna rewrite the narrative and we're gonna bolster it a little bit so that it makes more sense, or so that it's more interesting or more rich, or it's just clearer.
One for people that I think may be in a moment of discomfort and thinking through, if I'm asking questions about this text, if I'm questioning how I see this narrative, I think that's one of those moments they can find comfort in knowing that for a long period of time, people have been coming to this text to say, we have some questions, and they're providing answers and
Hmm.
expository detail. One, to
Right.
make it a little more entertaining potentially,
Yeah.
but two, because they're seeing these same things and saying,
Mhm.
wait, how did they know? Where are they
Right.
coming from? That
Yeah.
there's a real comfort for people
Hmm.
who should you be asking questions? We've always been
Yeah.
asking questions about this.
Right, and also with the revisionist impulse for some of these folks, I mean, there's also a kind of it's a very uh, uh, complicated debate, but there's also a debate in early Christianity about the sort of role of astrology, and a lot of
Yeah.
early Christian authors are really uncomfortable with astrology. They're like, that's what the pagans do. That's what the whatever, and so there's this discomfort with astrology, and yet in Matthew you have people coming from a foreign place who are led there by astrology. and,
Mm-hmm.
and so in some of these texts they kind of they have to sort of explain, well, maybe it wasn't really astrology. Maybe the star was not a star, or it was a star, but it was a special star. Or in one of these Syriac texts called the Revelation of the Magi, the star becomes Jesus himself, right? It's sort of it's a shape-shifting Jesus who does kind of lead them like a homing beacon towards their destination. And that author is sort of taking this discomfort with astrology and say, well, it wasn't astrology. They were really just kind of separatist Jews, and God sent them a sign and then led them to the place. And Matthew just described that as a star. Maybe he didn't know what was going on or something like that.
This is one of those things that I think some people may have heard before that I feel like I have to ask you about, given the genealogy that comes right before this.
Yes.
That we have these references to Babylon within that genealogy. And then we have here, okay, these individuals coming from the East, that some say, leaving the comment already, it's probably already down there, that these are Jews from Babylon who are traveling here. Is that one of these traditions that we get expanding within some of these earlier texts, or is that a later explanation that's trying to grab some of these different details from Matthew to smooth out what's happening there?
Yeah, I think my shooting from the hip, I think that's probably a little bit of a later tradition, but not terribly late. I think there are kind of hints of that. One of the hints of that, which I don't get into really at all in the book, just because it was a little bit out of place in it. But one of the interesting kind of points of contact between these two things is, Daniel in Babylon, and these stories about Daniel takes on the name Balthazar, and one of the Magi gets named Balthazar pretty early, like 7th century, or 6th or 7th century. So I think there are people who are thinking about that in that way. Like, is one of the Magi Daniel? Well, probably not, but they might be trying to kind of allude to, these people. And Daniel is described as being among the Magi in the Greek tradition, in the Greek translations of Daniel. And so, perhaps then people are imagining, other people in Daniel's cohort, and then their descendants, and they're sort of coming out from Babylon, returning to Judea to kind of reconnect and make that connection again. I think it's really interesting. I don't think it's what's going on with Matthew, but I do think that it's another one of those legitimate, really fascinating construals of meaning.
Within those, there's a long list of all the different ways people have grappled with these. Are there any significant trends that you've seen in the periods of time, and maybe closer to the common reading now that people have, that reflect different concerns that are prominent as they're turning towards these texts with questions that they're trying to grapple with, or questions of identity or meaning that are indicative of the ways the reading of Matthew has changed for the audience and what they're trying to find in this narrative?
Yeah, one of the threads that I kind of found when I was doing my research on this, and it was something that kind of only kind of appeared later in my research, like when I was already writing the book, was what I call the sort of Judeophobic reading of Matthew, and this emphasis that is very, very common in sermonic material or homiletic material, and also very common in a lot of commentaries. And that is this claim that the Magi were, that Matthew is imagining them just simply as Gentiles, right? And so non-Jews, and this idea that their Gentile identity is the most important thing about them for Matthew. And so this is one of those trends. It sort of starts pretty early, especially in the kind of patristic era, but it is also something that persists all the way through to the present. This idea that, well, Gentiles come from the East and they're the ones coming to worship Jesus. Now, on the face of it, it doesn't really seem all that problematic until you kind of see how this all plays out, right? So if this is what Matthew is up to, first of all, he's done a horrible job naming these characters, right? Because he's chosen a super complicated way to refer to Gentiles, where there are a dozen other ways that they could have been called the ethnoi, they could have been called people or men or whatever, but he chooses this super specific title for them, which also is not an exclusively Gentile title. Elymas in the book of Acts is a Jewish magos. So but the Gentile reading of them has very unfortunate consequences, because what ends up happening is you've got the Magi, who are positive characters, who are Gentiles, who come to Jerusalem seeking to worship the king or bow to the king or whatever. And then you have Herod and all of the advisors of Herod who have to, they don't even know where the Messiah is going to be born. They have to look it up, right? Like they don't even know their own traditions.
Right.
And then what Herod wants to do is not worship the Jewish Messiah. Herod just wants to slaughter him. And so then what you have is this dichotomy, which I don't think is on Matthew's radar, of the good Gentiles and the bad Jews. And that, obviously, we don't even have to go down that road to say that dichotomy has had just disastrous consequences. Right. And so, I think, Matthew is often described as, the Jewish gospel, right? That's problematic, because Matthew is a Jewish gospel in many, many, many anti-Jewish ways. But with the story of the Magi, that's one of the more curious interpretations that I've seen, that I just don't really think has much footing in the story itself.
And it is one that comes across, I think, in so many of the small ways that people fill in details, and not always intentionally, but how it leans into those things that has creeped across, I think is a worthwhile one to note for people as they're starting to ask questions over the way they see this nativity scene, the way they see Matthew's description here, the movies they might know with this. Some of these other questions that they should ask about this, how they're interpreting this or understanding this.
Yeah. And it's also sort of a great reminder that interpretations are not just these things where, well, you have yours and I have mine. Sometimes that's the case, but interpretations also have serious consequences sometimes. And this is one of those consequences where, people's lives have been at stake, right? And people have lost their lives because of that interpretation and others like it.
Well, Eric, I think that's a wonderful place to leave people a powerful moment for them to mull on. I want to thank you so much for joining us today to walk through a complicated, small narrative here with very few details and a lot of interpretations. So thank you for going through. If you liked this conversation and you're looking for more, well, yeah, you're in luck, because there's a whole book that has been written on this. So we'll put the link down in the description. I'd highly recommend you check it out. It's a very accessible read. Anybody can come in and find great information. So Dr. Eric Vanden Eykel, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, Jordan. Thanks for having me on.
For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Until next time.